Great to see everybody. As we just mentioned, so May is our focus on diversity and inclusion. And there's a lot that goes into diversity and inclusion. So, and that I'm really, really excited about Julie's presentation today because we kind of do a deep dive into a less discussed element of diversity and inclusion, which is cognitive diversity. I think there's a lot of talk about identity diversity markers, which are incredibly important. But cognitive diversity, this is something that we, I think, talk about less, but truly impacts all of us on a day-to-day basis at work, personally, professionally. And then even as Julie and I were talking about, gosh, in my marriage, it really impacts us a lot. And so I think she's got a really great presentation set up for you guys. There's some interactive poll opportunities. And also Julie, if you guys haven't met her before, she's a Denver member. She is one of the most fascinating, interesting, and lovely people in the world. She has a personal connection to this cause, and she's a wonderful presenter. So we're all in for a real treat today. Thank you for being with us today, and it is my pleasure to turn things over to Julie.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am, I'll be honest, I'm a little nervous to talk about this topic because I present a lot on marketing and other things related to my very long career in that field. But this is a newer topic for me to present on. So this is my first time presenting this. I've been studying it for years, both personally and professionally. And now I'm even making a pivot professionally that I'll talk about a little bit more at the end. But I'm going to go a little old school and low tech. I'm also at my parents' house. I am not in Denver. I am in Chandler, Arizona. And I've been here for a month, remote working and remote schooling with my family. So I'm a little out of my element. I'm actually in this, if you saw this room, you'd be like, whoa, it's not my usual office setup. So I've got my old school notes, and I'm not going to let technology stumble me over what I'm doing too much. So I'm actually going to be following these notes pretty closely because there's a lot I want to cover. And I want to make sure I get it all in there and give you guys an opportunity to also engage and interact with me. So without further ado, I am going to jump right in. So we should, can everybody see my screen now? Yes, no?
Not yet.
Okay.
Oh, there it goes.
Now, here we are. All right, great. Okay, so today, as we know, we're talking about not just recognizing, but I'm going to talk about how we celebrate cognitive diversity at work. And I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more once we get into this. But suffice it to say for now that I am a mom of a neurodiverse daughter. I identify as neurodiverse myself. I am a longtime marketing professional. And most recently, creator of a new podcast called Exceptional Girls. So I'm going to spend, obviously, some time talking about cognitive diversity and how we can be more inclusive of that in the workplace. But before I start there, I really want to hear from you what you think when you hear this term. So and what it was, that attracted you to this presentation. So first off, let's do a quick little housekeeping. Part of recognizing people's differences in the workplace is being sensitive to the fact that not everybody feels real comfortable, like just jumping in and talking, right? Some people like to hang back a little bit more, maybe are a little bit more introverted. So I want to encourage everybody to use the chat if you feel more comfortable sharing in a written way. And also make sure that people understand how to do that, right? The chat button, does everybody know how to use chat? I don't want to assume anything, right? There's a button on your screen that you click and you should get a pop-up window on the side where you can put answers in writing if you prefer. Or if you want to share, you can use the raise hand function. You can also raise your hand like this if you want, and Kate will be watching for that. But there's also a raise hand function under your reactions button. And of course, we like all kinds of other reactions, which I see a few popping up, which are lovely. So if you want a heart, thumbs up, do that kind of thing. I love that. So anyway, let's just take a few minutes, and I want to better understand what you think when you hear the term cognitive diversity. So Kate, if you want to let me know when people are ready to share their thoughts.
Absolutely. can personally say I did not know when I first heard the term. I was like, I need to think more about this. I actually Googled it immediately, actually.
Did you?
Which is
Yeah.
really exciting for me. And there's a lot of great information and resources out there, not nearly, as I said, as much as others, but I was not sure what it was at first. Oh, someone else said I Googled it as well.
Yeah, and that's good. I'm glad you guys did, because there's actually, there's a time where you might have done that and not found a whole lot, but there's actually a lot more talk about it nowadays. So what did you find, Kate?
Yeah. Well, so I will also say one of our attendees said different people process differently.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else said, I had no idea, and that's why I'm here. Actually, we have a couple of people saying,
Yay.
I have no idea what that means. So
That's
excited
good.
to learn and hear from you and find out more.
All right, cool. So I will be using the term cognitive diversity a lot today. I'm also going to be using the term neurodiversity, and I tend to use those terms interchangeably. But I'm kind of a word nerd, and I like to be, very specific with the right terminology. So I want to make sure that I address the fact that some people look at these things a little differently, right? So neurodiversity is more the term that's used to describe natural variations, right, in how our brains are wired, how we think, how we process information, how we process our environments, and how we experience the world, right? And neurodiversity speaks to that range of things. And that includes things like ADHD, autism, or ASD, which stands for autism spectrum disorder. I'm not a big fan of the term disorder, but I won't go down that rabbit hole. Intellectual giftedness, dyslexia, and other learning differences. So maybe you've heard of things like dyscalculia or dysgraphia. All these things fall under the neurodiversity umbrella. But I don't like to get too hung up on these diagnoses, right? One, because the whole term neurodiversity exists to kind of take the pathology out of these differences, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of talk about disorders and deficits and all these things, and there's really a movement to change the narrative and the language we use to more being about differences, right? These are naturally occurring differences. They don't need to be pathologized as disorders or deficits or things like that. And that's really what neurodiversity embraces. So whether or not people have a diagnosis is not important, right? If you experience things differently than other people and you feel that, then that is real. And that is really what I want to shine a light on. If there's nothing else you come away from today, it's that if you feel differently, or people who experience differently, right? That you maybe don't see things like a lot of other people do, or you don't experience the workplace the way other people do, then that's real, and that's authentic, and that's worthy of being accommodated, right? And being accepted. So by its simplest definition, we're going to talk about neurodiversity being just different ways of thinking and processing information. So then cognitive diversity is really more about the accepting and recognizing that diversity is a really good thing, right? That cognitive diversity is part of the broader scope. It falls under the umbrella of diversity as we talk about it a lot, and that it deserves, to have its own focus and be part of the narrative, because it's very real. Like I said, when you experience things differently, it can be very challenging if you don't even really acknowledge it yourself, and you're just sort of struggling and you don't know why. But it's also challenging if other people don't see that in you. So the whole cognitive diversity piece is more about kind of putting neurodiversity into action and really being aware of it, supporting it, accepting it, and diversity in all its forms. So this there's been, like I said, there's been a lot of talk about cognitive diversity and neurodiversity recently, way more than before. In fact, neurodiversity is a pretty new term and concept. But I like this quote from Forbes. This is an article from about a year and a half ago. And, it's really, it's important that we take some time to focus on this. So I'm glad that you all took time out of your day to do it. Particularly as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, are getting a lot of increased attention and investment, and it's about time, right? I think we can all agree with that. The notion of what diversity means is also expanding, right? And certainly it includes, differences in identity, like Kate mentioned, right? Race, religion, culture, gender identity, sexuality. And a lot of those things are a little more visible or obvious differences, but it also includes a lot of invisible differences, right? And that's where the cognitive diversity piece really comes in. These people may look normal to you, right? Or they may seem successful, but on the inside, they may be experiencing things very differently. So we want to, we just want to make sure that we're thinking about all the ways that we can embrace people's differences. So now that we kind of have a little bit of an understanding of what we mean by cognitive diversity, and honestly, just diversity generally, I'm just really curious. I want to get a temperature check. I don't know everybody's backgrounds, whether you work, for yourself, so you're a company of one, right? But I still want you to think about it if that's the case. Or if you work in a broader environment, or even you can look at, a place like Rise as your workspace, right? Not to put anybody on the spot, but I just want to get a sense of how well would you say that your current environment supports diversity?
And I'll also note, because both the polls that we're going to be doing today are on the anonymous setting. So if you ever felt nervous about whether anyone,
we're definitely,
or they're all anonymous, nothing can be shared.
Yes, thank you. So far, we've got 40% extremely well, 40% somewhat well, 20% not well at all. Anybody else want to pop an answer in before we close this out? Although I'd say our numbers are small, so they're probably not, they don't have a ton of statistical relevance, right? But almost spread, right, kind of across the spectrum. And I think that's pretty typical nowadays, right? The reality is there is a lot of talk about diversity and inclusion, right? But they're very hard, particularly the inclusion part is very hard to do well, right? It just is. It's much easier to talk about it. So today we're going to talk about some very specific things that we can do to be more, to not just talk about diversity, but be truly inclusive of it. Before we do that, though, I imagine you may be, curious about why I'm talking about neurodiversity and why you would listen to me even talk about it. And so I want to share a little bit of my backstory because it's relevant. So I am the mom of a neurodiverse daughter myself. My daughter, Madeline, is 15, almost 16 now. And she specifically is what's known as twice exceptional. So she's highly gifted intellectually, right? But she also has challenges socially with attention and with anxiety. I also identify as neurodiverse, though I do not have the diagnoses that my daughter has, right? And the reality is that many adults don't. A lot of us learn about this through our kids, right? And our kids get some sort of a diagnosis or something isn't working for them. And then we kind of go, yeah, this sounds familiar, right? And these differences are also highly heritable, which means that they are very genetically, related. So once you've had this veil kind of lifted and you relate to it, you start to see it in your family, you start to see it in your friends. Like attracts like, right? This is, we start to really notice how a lot of the other people in your life maybe have some of these same differences. So for me, it wasn't just a gee whiz, kind of cool moment. It was really a life-changing thing, right? It's been life-changing for my daughter because she had very big struggles in school. Starting at about first grade, right? She was a very early learner, very early reader, a very voracious and precocious kid. But about first grade, the wheels started to come off the bus for her, right? She started to get stomach aches every day, didn't want to go to school anymore. And that's when we kind of started down this investigative path. And, fast forward to today, and she got these diagnoses didn't all happen at once. This was a 10-year process, right? And so, now that we know this about her, she has done a complete 180, right? Not just as a student, but as a person. She just has so much more understanding of herself now and is really thriving and is really living up to her full potential. And it's very near and dear to my heart, because I've experienced it so personally, and not just through her, but with me. Now, when I can look back on my life, a lot of things that never made sense to me are starting to make sense now, right? Like why I struggled with certain things, how I could be so good at this and have such a hard time with that, right? And so there I had a whole lot of internal negative dialogue that I really wasn't even aware of until I started to better understand these differences and started to see them in myself and how I had experienced them. So now that I have this understanding, it's made such a difference, right? I'm more self-accepting for one, which is huge. But I also perform better because I understand what conditions I perform best in, right? And I'm also relearning how to trust my ability to make good career decisions because I made some pretty poor decisions along the way and had some really kind of embarrassing things happen as a result. And a lot of people who know me may be surprised to hear that because my persona is very confident and competent and all these things. But again, I've learned, I learned to mask and how to fit in, right? And I learned how to be a good girl and show up the way I meant to. But it took a tremendous amount of energy, and I was really struggling, behind the scenes. So to me, aside from just knowing what I've gone through personally, as I've learned more about this, I learned that many other people experience this as well, and particularly women, because socially and culturally, there are certain expectations of us that we are very perceptive and learn to live into, right? So a lot of times we get lost. But it isn't just women. There are lots of people who experience these differences and may not even fully understand it themselves, right? They may not even know that they're experiencing it because it's just been such a part of the fabric of their lives for so long. So having said that, right, and I'm not trying to do any diagnoses here, but I just want to shine a light on some of the ways that people experience the workplace differently. So there's another poll that I'm going to have Kate put up, and I just want you to see if there's any of these statements that you relate to. And while she's doing that, I'll say, that I mentioned this before, I'm making a pivot now in my own career after spending, 25 plus years and largely in marketing roles and marketing leadership roles. I'm actually at 52, getting my doctorate in education and really specializing in cognitive diversity and cognitively diverse learners. And, I'm really excited about it. And it's sort of a long lost bucket list item that I also unearthed as I learned more, about myself and how I was also neurodiverse, just like my daughter. So,
That's
just
amazing. While people are finishing up their entering your poll things, I did want a great question came in via chat, Julie, that I thought now would be a good time to
perfect.
Whether do mental health disorders fall under the realm of neurodiversity or are they considered different?
So this is a really good question, right? In fact, I'll try not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but neurodiversity is very much a psychological concept, right? And for those of us who are parents and we first get introduced to these things through our kids, it's generally done in an educational setting. And there's a lot of focus on it from an educational setting, but it's very much a psychological thing. And my 2 cents worth, and this isn't without research to back it up, although I won't cite all those resources, is that a lot of mental disorders are the result of undiagnosed neurodiversity. That's, a lot of anxiety. People, it's kind of a chicken and egg. Which comes first, like anxiety or, like the condition, right? And most people are starting to agree that anxiety is a result of the condition not being recognized, right? Or not being treated, right? And not really understanding what's going on with you. So you start to, manifest in a lot of different ways. But would I say that bipolar disorder, for example, is a neurodiversity? Now, to me, they're kind of two different things. But like, so for example, you probably experience the world very differently, though, and so you should certainly be, under that umbrella of cognitive diversity. But I believe that it ventures into a different medical territory, right? That and granted, ADHD brains and autism brains also look different. If you look at scans of these brains, that kind of the heat map of the brain, it actually fires in a little bit different ways. People with dyslexia is the same. But I wouldn't say that mental health disorders and neurodiversity are one and the same. But I do believe that mental health disorders can be compounded by undiagnosed neurodiversity.
No, it makes sense.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and we can share results. Make sure
Yeah.
you're seeing them.
All right, cool. So a lot of people, looks like most people, I feel stressed or anxious when I'm not clear what's expected of me. And I love this question, right? Because I think this is true of most all people, right? Like some people thrive in ambiguity, but a lot of people don't, right? And by the way, all these statements are things that I personally experience, right? Which is, but it's not just me. I study this in particularly women, but in a lot of people with cognitive diversity. Or people who experience neurodiversity. And like I said, you tend to use those terms interchangeably. But this is not uncommon, and these are a spectrum. We all experience some of this stuff some of the time. What makes it kind of fall under the category of diagnoses is when it starts to impact your life negatively, right? Or it's starting to impact your ability to perform or do the things that you need to do in life. And that's when people tend to seek a diagnosis. But I think it's important to realize that, this is kind of the point, right? We all have some of this. So the more we can accommodate everyone and think about, ways that we can be more inclusive of a lot of different ways of experiencing things, the better off we'll be. So moving along then, this kind of starts to get us into, why should we care, right? We have a lot of things going on in the world, between COVID and other stuff in our personal lives. So why should we care about cognitive diversity? Well, I think we can all agree, right, about the importance of being accepting and accommodating of differences in others. But the goal of diversity, right, it needs to go beyond just equity, right, to really embracing this. The differences aren't things we should just tolerate, right? And we shouldn't just accept them. We should actually seek them out and embrace them. And again, diversity, we're talking about all types of diversity. And so why should we do this? Well, because everybody's more successful when they feel like they're part and included. So, when we broaden the way we talk and think about diversity, we want to make sure that everyone feels relevant and that they feel part of, a shared goal and a shared vision, and that we're really making sure we're encompassing the full complexity of how people might be different and how they might experience things differently. And, that we really need to have, beyond just demographic equality, we need to also have like true diversity of thinking, right? Because when we do that, that's really the ultimate goal, because we start to have, people showing up more fully as themselves. They're more engaged, right? They're working to their strengths. And not only are individuals more successful, but our organizations are more successful as well. And I love this quote from another Fortune article. Like I said, this stuff is being talked about a lot more, which is great. And so we're really starting to get a better understanding about it. And people are really starting to see it become talked about more in the workplace. So there are really tangible outcomes that come out of this, right? So from an organizational perspective, it's worth investing some time and energy into thinking about diversity in all its forms, because we all know the danger of groupthink, right? It's what I used to call drinking the corporate Kool-Aid, right? When we're all kind of yes people, we've all kind of been in the company for a while, or we've always done things around here this way, we're not really innovating, right? And when you're doing things the same way over and over again, you're going to get the same results. So we really need different ways of thinking and solving problems to innovate. And as the visual shows here, this is a study that was done in Australia. The innovation actually goes up by 20% when you have, a diverse group of people working on problems and coming up with solutions. But you also identify risks quicker, right? And weaknesses and threats. So your risk level goes down. And, this is why it's so important to not just talk about diversity, but let's put it into practice, right? And we have to actually demonstrate that we value it. And this is where a lot of workplaces, frankly, fall down, we talk about it, but are we really demonstrating it? And doing that requires some examination, right, about the language that we use, the way we talk about our culture, the way we talk about our values. And I'll go a little bit more into that, into some practical tips, but the takeaway here is that diversity without inclusion doesn't produce the results, right? We really need to be truly inclusive. And when we do that, right, then it's a real game changer, right? Not only do we see, these incremental improvements, but we start to see really significant improvements in our organizations. 2 times, more likely to meet or exceed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative. So this is why, right? This is why it's worth spending the time on, and it's worth us taking the time today, and worth us, really thinking about how this shows up in our organizations and doing what we can to influence it positively. So I'm going to pause for a minute because I can get real excited and talk. Are there any questions anybody wants to ask before I get into some of the real practical applications of how we can be more inclusive?
I don't have any questions in chat, but feel free to pop off mute if you have any questions you want to.
Okay. Yeah, I can only see certain people. I kind of minimize my screen because I don't like to get too distracted by it. So first of all, it's kind of a 2-step process, right? It starts with awareness, right, of what diversity looks like. And so we need to recognize and accept those, who think differently, who process differently, and who experience the world differently than we do. And that encompasses all forms of diversity, right? The experiencing the world differently is a pretty big statement, and that encompasses our racially diverse people, our culturally diverse people who identify different sexually or gender-wise than we do. So I really want to stress that this is about broad diversity. But then beyond that, right, it's really about not just recognizing or accepting or tolerating. We really want to celebrate them, right? Because this is what makes the world interesting. It's what helps us think bigger and come up with newer ideas. If you look at companies that are really doing innovative things like Apple, for example, they really embrace this concept. And I was going to put a slide in here about it, but I didn't want to go down that. But just Google it if you want to read more about, some of the things that Apple talks about and how they really embrace innovation. But for our purposes, many of us don't work for the Apples of the world. Even if we have small companies, there are very real things that we can do to start to be more inclusive. So
hey, Julie, we got a raised hand real quick. I didn't, Jana, would you want to pop off mute and ask your question real quick to Julie?
Thank you. And maybe you're getting into that in your next slide. But some things, I mean, obviously culturally and as far as ethnicity and race, you can identify some of those things yourself as a business owner, or but as far as thinking, like this type of neurodiversity, people don't, that's not something you can see, and people aren't going to like openly discuss that, or it's not going to be on a resume. So how is that, how are you seeing or advising others to identify that, or their employees to share that?
Right. I think the key is that you shouldn't necessarily have to identify it, right? You shouldn't have to self-disclose. The environment should just be so accommodating to everyone that you don't necessarily need to go there. To me, that's the ultimate, right? Like, we just have these environments where it's so obvious that we value differences, we encourage discourse, we encourage debate, we encourage people to really show up as themselves and have out of the box ideas and be able to work in ways that work for them, such that it's not about identifying the individuals and accommodating the individuals. It's about making the whole environment more accommodating for everyone. Does that make sense? So once we get through this, though, like, let's come back to that, okay? Because I want to make sure that I answer this, because this is super important. It's a really great question, and it's kind of clear to me But once I go through this, if it's not still clear, let's unpack it a little bit more. So to me, it starts, not to me, the other experts would agree with me, to hire diverse applicants, you need to attract them first, right? And so it really starts like, in recruiting and looking at things like your job postings and your job descriptions. And, if any of you have been in hiring roles before, and I know I have, a lot of times we kind of hate having to write that job listing or that job description, and really having to distill down what it is we're looking for. So we tend to use a lot of general terms, like they need to be strong communicators, they need to be team players, and all these things that are really just sort of blanket statements that don't apply to every single role, right? If you are a software developer, for example, your communication skills maybe don't need to be that strong, right? And you may not think you have strong communication skills because you're much more comfortable working with information, right? And do you need to work in a team environment? Yes, maybe you need to go to a stand-up meeting for 15 minutes a day, but then you're back at your desk and you actually do your best work focused in a quiet area by yourself. When you see team environment, nowadays, I think we think of like these bullpen workspaces, where everything's open and people are like collaborating and they're playing games and like, playing foosball and doing this stuff, and not everybody works well that way. I personally, while I think it's kind of cool to walk into offices like that, I hate working that way, right? Like I need an office. I need quiet space to do my work. I love to come together, brainstorm. Let's get our to-dos, and then let's disperse. Let's go do our work. That's more how I like to operate. And I come from a marketing background, right? An ad agency background early in my career. But even so, like that just didn't work for me. I need to be able to go off and do work in a quiet space. So, we need to think about, are we using these general broad scope terms to describe jobs, but they really don't reflect what the job entails, right? And distinguishing between actual requirements versus nice to haves. People who are neurodiverse, and I don't want to generalize too much, but particularly like people who are autistic are very literal. So they will read the job description, and if they do not have 5 exact years of experience as the job description says, then they will not apply, right? They're like, that's not me, right? It said 5 years. I have 4. I'm not qualified, right? So really thinking about, is that really a requirement, or would it just be a nice to have? Is it a preference? And really differentiating between what they need to have to be successful in this role, and not just checking the easy box or having HR do it, right? But actually investing some time ourselves in what we're looking for in a person to fit a specific role, and writing much clearer job listings and job descriptions. Also, using alternatives. This is a little revolutionary. I don't see a lot of people doing it, but not just doing text only job listings and job descriptions. But what if you had a video of someone who does the job talking about what they do in the job, right? Or what if you had, a more visual presentation of what a typical day might look like? I've seen a lot of job postings lately where they're like, your first week, you're going to be doing this. Your first month, you're going to be focusing on this. Your first 90 days, you're going to be doing this. And to me, those are stepping in the right direction. I love that, right? Like, let's be more clear around what's really involved in the job. Because like I said, a lot of people will take this very literally. And I also know for a fact that a lot of women tend to do the same thing. If we're not perfectly qualified, we're not applying. Men aspire, like they're like, oh yeah, I'm not exactly that, but I'm close enough and I'll figure it out. Women are like, okay, I'm not exactly perfect for the job, so I shouldn't apply, right? So this is what I mean. It's not just about, being, making sure we're addressing people who have known, conditions like autism. It's just thinking about for everybody, right? How can we be more specific and more clear about what it really is that we're looking for, and make it accessible to people who have a variety of different ways of taking in information and absorbing information. So this also starts to get into what your culture is communicating. And I could do a whole hour just on this, but we tend to, if you read, job descriptions or you look in companies, we tend to favor people who have worked in the same industry for a very long time, right? Or hire people who look a lot like the person who had the job previously. But in doing that, we're kind of limiting, right, the diversity that we're introducing into our organization. And it kind of goes back to what I said before about groupthink. If we're all kind of coming from the same place and we've all kind of come from the same world, then we're all kind of coming up with the same solutions to the same problems, to the same ways we've always done things, right? So thinking about, okay, is it really necessary that they have, industry experience? Why, and if so, why? Why do we value that, right? Are we prioritizing that over actually maybe getting some new and fresh ideas around here, instead of just bringing the same kind of people into the mix? And then also, are you subtly or blatantly valuing extroversion over introversion? And this is a whole, kind of cultural phenomenon. And again, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there about this. There's a great talk, this quote at the bottom. Susan Cain did a TED talk called The Power of Introverts. How many people here identify as introverts? Just raise your hand informally if you do. Does anybody? I call myself an ambivert. I can kind of go both ways, right? I like a lot of time. I get a lot of energy and ideas from people, and then I'm exhausted, and then I need to go home and like completely decompress. But a lot of people identify as introverts. A lot of entrepreneurs identify as introverts. I know Stacy identifies as an introvert, right? Like she shows up, you'd never guess that about her, but it's actually draining, for her to show up that way. So, and as a society and in many of our companies, we are sort of valuing this extroversion over introversion. Yet introverts bring a lot to the table, a lot of strengths, right? In terms of, being able to do highly focused work, right? Really going deep into complex problems and having really novel ideas and really novel approaches. They're more information oriented, typically than people oriented, right? They get their juice from working with information, and we need people like that in every company, right? It isn't just about, like the people who are the sales and marketing people who seem like all outgoing, right? You need people who are actually producing product, right? Or producing new solutions to things. So looking at your culture is a much bigger thing, right? But there's definitely a bias that many companies have, and they may not even be aware of it. So because that's a big one, I'm going to bring it back down to the practical again. And learning about different personality types and the strengths and challenges that come with each, I find to be really invaluable. And again, this kind of gets us out of the thinking of, specific cognitive diversities that we need to accommodate, and just thinking more broadly, right, about how can we, make sure that we're bringing the best out of everybody on this team. So things like the Myers-Briggs, StrengthsFinder, Colby. I've used all these tools in hiring and found them to be really, really helpful. Sometimes companies have other, assessment tools that they use if you work in a bigger company. But these are things, StrengthsFinder is available to anybody. Colby, they're all pretty low priced, or they have free versions as well. Just to really better understand the individual, right? And not just looking at the team or the group, but how can we really start to think about the individual and really playing to their strengths, and really understanding their challenges and supporting those, and not expecting people to be, these super people who do everything really, really well, right? Let's really have a strengths-based approach. And this is largely what I'm studying in my doctoral program, is really strengths-based learning, right? And getting away from, trying to always like fix the deficit and making incremental improvements, and really focusing on the strengths, where people have infinite possibilities, right? And it's same concept in the workplace. But it's also important, not to overgeneralize. Like when I share things about autism, like I did about tending to be literal thinkers, I don't want us to get into this, thinking of, oh, okay, well, all autistic people are like that. Not necessarily, right? Again, we don't want to stereotype. That's going against the whole point of being, of being inclusive. It's not about, making sure that we're tailoring to these types of individuals. It's about thinking, broadly, how can we be more inclusive of a lot of different ways of thinking and being? So ask questions and actually hear the answers to really learn. Just ask people, right? And if they don't have that self-awareness, and sometimes they won't, then you can use tools like this, and those will help them and you better understand their strengths. And then this is a little cultural, but there are lots of small ways that we can create space for innovation, right? And this tends to invite inclusivity, is, giving people more time to solve problems, right? And not necessarily like having to do that in brainstorming sessions on the spot, right? Maybe you have brainstorming sessions and then you let people go away and process. I know I need to do that. And I'm a highly creative person who has a bazillion ideas, but I cannot, but brainstorming, I suck at that. Like I love to have that interchange. Then I need to go away and then I need to let it soak. And then I can come back to you with better ideas. There's a lot of people like this, right? And they just need more time to process and to figure things out and to come up with better ideas. Sometimes if we're rushing people that way or doing it in a way that doesn't work for them, we're not going to come up with the best solutions. It's also about rewarding attempts and risks, not just successes. And how often do we really celebrate like our failures, right? Because at least we tried, at least we tried to do something different. Oftentimes we also don't even take time to recognize our successes, right? But we sure as hell aren't acknowledging the risks we're taking and the attempts that we're making that maybe weren't that successful, but that we learned from, right? And that's how we innovate. And this again, it's not about specific diversities or cognitive differences. It's just thinking about how can we invite innovation, because that is naturally going to be a diverse environment, right? And so it's a little conceptual, but these are very real things that if you look around your workplaces, you can start to recognize or start to influence. And even seeking out different perspectives, right? I mean, I've worked in companies where they do this kind of good, and then I've worked in companies where they really do it straight up terrible. Like it's a bunch of yes people, right? The leadership is surrounded by yes people, right? And I could use I could call them sycophants and different things, which is what I would do if I were being snarky. But you know what I mean, right? They're just sort of surrounded by these people who are like, oh yes, it's fantastic. And meanwhile, they're like, oh my gosh, this is such a terrible idea. It's never going to work, but they're not encouraged. They're afraid, right? So how can we really create cultures where we want, to have, healthy discourse and debate and differences, right? And let's talk it out and come up with better ideas. Making sensory accommodations part of the workspace. And honestly, this benefits a lot of people. This gets a little bit more into the question, right, about, ways that we can be a little more specific. Things like noise canceling headphones, having those available to people instead of having to, have to bring their own. Especially if you have open workplaces, and who knows what the workplace of the future is going to look like, but bear with me, right? They're very helpful. I personally cannot talk on the phone if there's any background noise. I hear everything and it's just like, oh, I get very agitated and stressed. And I love my noise canceling headphones, and I know a lot of people who do. Sit stand desks, right? I also I'm up moving around, standing. I do way better, and I like to work standing up and sitting down. Like that question I asked in the poll, are you the kind of person who gets up during a meeting and has to move around? Me. It's sit stand desks are awesome. It gives you some options, right? Just having balance balls and fidgets and plants, and just the plants part being, it's just, there's something soothing about it to somebody who's sensory and really notices the aesthetics of a space. It's part of the reason I love Rise in Denver. I don't know how many are Rise Denver people, but it's just and I think St. Louis is similar. It's just such a calming, kind of quiet, orderly space. It really works for somebody like me. Like I don't like a lot of crazy distractions and noises and stuff. So that's very important. It has a ton of natural light. A lot of people who are neurodiverse have a sensitivity to things like fluorescent lighting. They can hear it buzzing. It has a low hum. Again, I'm one of these people. I never knew it about myself until I realized that in every job I've ever had, I always had to bring in my own lighting, and I'd ask maintenance to remove the fluorescent lights above my desk. But I never really thought about why they bothered me so much, because I can hear them humming. I'm actually that sensitive. And a lot of people who are neurodiverse have these heightened antennae. It's a great way to think about it. And maybe you do too, right? Do you hear everything? Do you notice everything? Do these little subtleties and little things in the environment really, are they really distracting to you? We need to think about these kinds of things and give people opportunities to work in spaces, not having these, these big, crazy Google type spaces where there's a lot of, craziness. You can have some of that, but then you need to have quiet spaces too, right? Have individual work rooms where people can go and do quiet work, right? Or even meditation rooms you see in some environments nowadays, which is fantastic. Supporting hybrid work arrangements. We should be seeing a whole lot more of this in the future if you didn't have that today. I've worked from home for a long time and it makes me very happy to do so. I also love to work in a coffee shop, right? But having the option, I go to Rise, I can work at home, I can go to the space I need to be in to do the kind of work I need to do at that time. And giving people that flexibility is huge if you want to get the best work out of them. So it's really ultimately like focus on the what and not the how, right? What is it that we want people to produce? What's the problem we want to solve, right? And give them some flexibility around how they get there, right? If that means they need to work from home some of the time, if that means they need, a quiet space to process or more time to process, then let's be accommodating of that. So, those are a lot, of ideas, right, about things that we can start to do, and maybe just spark some thoughts, right, for you to start to pay attention, to what things you can start to have an influence over yourself. The idea is, and we talk about this a lot in the neurodiversity world, it's, all too often we expect people to assimilate to our environment, right? But inclusion really, from the broadest perspective, is about changing, the environment to accommodate more and different people, right? How can we, create, the space and the place and the environment to be more inclusive, to help more people feel like they belong here and like they can be productive here and like they can be their best selves in the space. So, did that help answer the question? I think it was it who did I'm sorry, I can't see everybody because I'm still sharing my screen.
Jana,
Jana.
Was that helpful?
Yeah, that was helpful. The list that you shared too,
Yeah.
even like the noise counseling, phones and things like that, because you don't want to assume anything. You want to be prepared. And if anybody has any type of special need, you kind of just want to have some kind of advanced setup or anything in place ahead of you don't want to ask. You just want to kind of have those things in place,
Exactly. That's a great point. I'm so glad you said that, right? People, there are lots of us trying to help people self-advocate, and trying to help them ask for what they need. But in an ideal world, it would just be available, right? And it wouldn't be a big deal, and they wouldn't have to be singling out excuse me, can I get this? Right? Like you just have these things available to people. So I think it requires both, right? People need to ask for what they want if they're not getting it. But we also need to be better at just kind of making this stuff available and just trying to preempt, a little bit and think more about what we can do to have accommodations for people who might need them and maybe not make them so obvious so they don't feel singled out, right?
It makes me think, you pointed out how Stacy, for example, is an introvert. She also talks often, in our team meetings and in meetings, how she's on the spectrum, undiagnosed, but she's like, there's no doubt about it that she was on, and people are like, really? Are you sure? And she's like, and as her business partner, I can confirm, absolutely. But I think that vulnerability and openness and sharing, whether it's you personally, whether it's a loved one, there's been the more, as with all of these types of diversity, the more we can talk about it and make it less of a, can I go there? Can I talk about that? The more vulnerable as leaders, or even if we're not the owner of the company, even still just being open and honest and creating a safe space to talk about things, I think can really open the door for other people then to feel safe to self-advocate, which is something they need to do. We can't read everybody's minds, especially the less identity diverse things. But if we're talking about it, then it makes it less taboo to even bring up.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, Kate, because that's what a lot of people say. They're like, "Oh, well, you can't be this. You don't look like that. You're not like Rain Man, you're not this, you're not that." Like really, this is the kind of things that we hear. But, this is why I think it's so I'm so passionate about talking about this and trying to be more transparent myself now that I've learned this about myself, because I really didn't even know it was there for so long. And it creates a lot of shame, right? It creates a lot of pain. I mean, I've had a lot of experiences where I couldn't, I was so, like, for example, I took a job 4 years ago at 48. Okay. I took a job, and I've obviously had lots of jobs, and I'm pretty, at a pretty good level in my career. I took this job thinking I knew what I was getting into because it was with a client of mine, and they offered me a full-time job, and I took it. And I got into that work environment, and within 3 weeks I was miserable, and I quit 10 weeks later at 48. And I was like, how can I be so stupid? How couldn't I see that this wasn't a good fit for me? Right. But I just didn't know until I was in the space, and the environment was like one of those busy bullpen environments where I was expected to sit at a desk, and there were people all around me, and there's people moving around, and they have virtual reality headsets, and they've got foosball tables, and they've got this. And I was just like, oh, hell no. Like, I cannot work this way. Like, I would spend all my time in the phone booth, like the little phone booths we have. I'd be in there like, oh God, like, I can't work this way. And I also had a boss, who, there was a lot of other things at play, but I didn't feel like I could speak up about it. I was afraid. And I just thought there was something wrong with me, that I couldn't thrive in this environment. And so it all worked out, right? But I carried a ton of shame about that until I just pieced it together like a year ago, and this is the reality for a lot of us who don't, like, we don't even really notice sometimes how sensitive we are to things. We don't have the vocabulary for it, right? So the more we can, help people just feel more comfortable, and we can be more accepting of them, the better it is for everybody, because there's a lot of people going around not understanding why they're struggling.
Absolutely. Christy, I see Christy Jones just raised her hand.
Yeah. Hey, can you hear me? I know I'm in the car, so I'm struggling a bit.
Yeah, you're
okay, good. This is super interesting, and I wanted to share something as assuming that a lot of people are also leaders in this group. I had an employee, this is several years, like we're talking 20 years ago, but I used to make candidates come into the office to take.
Oh, shoot, we're missing
Oh,
you.
no.
Breaking up at the
You mentioned some of them are a little hesitant. Hold on. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good. Okay, you said
Okay.
you used to have candidates come in and.
All right. He asked me if I was really hesitant to do so, but I agreed. And then I hired him. And when he came into the office about a weekend, he asked me if I would buy him a software program called Dragon Naturally Speaking. And I hadn't heard of it. I was like, well, tell me why you need it. What's it for? And he says, I have a learning disability and dyslexia, which is why I asked to take the assessment at home. He said, my wife had to read the questions and the answers to me. And he said, I can't, he's like, you don't want me sending out proposals and putting notes in a CRM system without talking to text or talking to write. And so it was shocking to me. He was an A player. He was an A player for me. He was an A player for other companies. And I remember having the conversation with him, how did you get this far? I mean, he was so disabled from a learning perspective that he had to have a proctor in college go with him to every class. But I from that point forward, I allowed candidates to take the assessment at home because I didn't want them to feel embarrassed about asking me about it. And really, there was some math and verbal, I call it ACT meets Myers-Briggs. But I was I wondered how many candidates after that I had put in a weird position or that didn't do well in the assessment because they were embarrassed to tell me that they were going to need help taking it.
That's a fantastic example, right? I think that happens way more often than we realize. Because how would we know unless they told us, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, and brave for.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny because it makes me think how brave of him for bringing it up. But then again, it's it takes that, it's a muscle that I'm sure he's built for years. It sounds like it's something he's learned to navigate throughout his whole career. And so great that he had built that muscle, but how few people often have built that muscle or have had the opportunity to build that muscle to educate. And yeah, it's vulnerable to say,
It
hey,
is.
but it's also, it's gift giving. As you said, think about what a gift that was. Yep. That he's given you 20 years later that has still stuck around with you, that has been a gift to everyone that you've encountered since. So it makes me think a lot too about speaking up and advocating for myself and making a safe space for other people to do that for themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and with great challenges often come great strengths, right? So, we have to, if we can get beyond that. Sometimes the challenges become so big that we never see the person's strengths, and that's just as sad, right? Like we have to be able to realize that that everybody has strengths, right? We can't put people in a box of, okay, well, this person, has this problem, so, they're not useful to us, right? I mean, most people with neurodiversity, really formally diagnosed like autism, are severely underemployed, because people only focus on the challenge and they don't see the great strengths there as well. So, my slide now is, just some things that you can think about, some things that you might be able to do to make a difference. But it's really, like the famous quote, be the change you want to see in the world, right? And think about, how can you examine your own biases, right? How can you, start to identify blind spots in your organization? And just how can we be more curious, right, about other people's viewpoints and experiences? How often do we stop and ask, right? How often do we really dig into that with the people we work with and around and for? And how can we have more conversations, right? And kind of take it out of the shadows and let's talk about it. And be committed, to challenging the status quo, right? Like looking at how we do things around here, and are there better ways that we could do things? And really start to be part of, creating the conditions that we need, right, to be more inclusive. So, this is kind of a summary of the takeaway that I want to make. That we really, I mean, obviously equity is huge, and I'm not trying to diminish that in any way. But what I want us to do is just take a broader look at it, right? And let's make sure we're including, all the different ways that people experience the world differently than we might, and they might move through the world differently than we do. And let's just not, talk about it or think about it, but let's make sure that we're really being accepting and inclusive of everybody. And then, as they say, knowledge without action is pretty useless. So, is there anything that anybody wants to share? One thing that they might take away from this that they could implement or do to be more inclusive? Oh, come on.
I would say takeaway for me was about how not everyone running a Zoom, for example, like giving options for, say, a breakout room, to say, hey, if you prefer not to go in a breakout room, shoot me a quick note and I won't put you in a breakout room. Because for some people, being put on the spot, that might feel really uncomfortable. So creating an anonymous forum for someone to do that. So as someone who facilitates a lot of events, I might try to start integrating that, giving the option for people, no matter what their preference is.
Right. Kate and I talked about that a little bit beforehand, and I purposely didn't do breakout rooms for that reason. So if anybody was disappointed we didn't do them, I apologize, but I had a reason, right? Because I know for some people it's incredibly anxiety producing to get thrown into a room with somebody they've never met or talked to before and have to do that, right? So I didn't want to put anybody on the spot. I love to get to know people. I've learned, to love it. But I tend to come across super domineering in those because I'm so afraid of being awkward that I just kind of take over, and I don't really like showing up that way, if I'm being honest. So I didn't do those on purpose, but I hope that you guys, we're still able to engage in other ways. I wanted to try to make it more inclusive, and it's really tricky. I'm learning too. I'm not the expert on this, right? I have a lot of passion for it, and I'm learning all the time. But yeah, I'm right there with you in terms of learning how to do it better. So here's a final stat. Roughly 6.5 million people in the US have learning, thinking, or developmental differences. And if you think about it on a broad scale, it doesn't seem like that many, but these are really just the people who are diagnosed. And I can assure you that most adults don't have a diagnosis, especially people like my age. People coming up in their 20s and 30s, a lot of them, have had a lot more, they've had the benefit of having earlier diagnoses and better understanding. But those of us who've been in the workplace a long time often didn't benefit from that. So we're still learning it, or may not even be aware of it. But one thing that I'm doing, because I am so passionate about this, because I really believe we can change people's trajectories in life if we give them early opportunities, right? And we're being, we're paying more attention at an early age, is I'm launching a podcast. It's purely that. This is not something I'm trying to sell or program or anything like that. It may evolve to something over time, but right now it's just that I want to increase the dialogue about what neurodiversity looks like, and particularly in girls, so that more women don't end up struggling through life, not realizing why they feel so different and why they experience things differently. So this is my passion project that I'm is in pre-production right now, and I'll be launching it this summer. So if you know a parent of a daughter who's a little quirky or different or is struggling, or you as a woman feel that way a little bit yourself sometimes, then I hope you'll check out the podcast or share it with somebody who you think might benefit. And that's the end of my presentation.
Well, this was fantastic, Julie. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, gifts, and advice. I think what I really loved too was tangible advice and things that we can do and think about. So I think this was wonderful and a great resource for everyone who joined us live and then also who will be watching this on record. So thank you guys. Thank you, Julie. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Lots of great thanks and everything in the chat and compliments. Good job, girlfriend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you in person or online on Race Digital again soon. Bye.
Bye.